The lie had a color. Tonight, it was the deep, velvety blue of dusk, mixed with the silver of crushed moon petal and a single forbidden drop of her own blood. It smelled of nightshade and secrets. Marian Lerwin painted the sigil onto the worn stone of her windowsill, her brushstrokes a silent prayer against discovery. The cold of the granite seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, a constant reminder of her place in this world. A ghost in a wolf's court, an Omega without the fire of a wolf in her soul. The moon, a heavy, swollen pearl in the sky, should have been a source of power. For the others, it was a call to the wild, a song that thrummed in their blood and sharpened their senses. For Marian, it was an accusation. It illuminated the hollow space inside her, the profound, aching silence where a howl should have been. Her magic, the quiet, humming power that flowed through her veins, was a perversion of their nature, something to be hidden at all costs. They called her wolfless, a broken thing, and so she painted. She painted sigils of protection on doorframes, luck on hunting bows, and health on the cradles of newborns, all while the real magic swirled beneath the surface, a desperate act of concealment. Each stroke was a lie that kept her alive. A sudden chill, colder than the stone beneath her, snaked up her spine. It wasn't the wind, it was the shift in the atmosphere of the keep, a ripple of tension that even her dulled senses could detect. The distant sounds of the pack in the training yard, the grunts, the clash of steel, the low rumbles of dominance, had fallen silent. That was never a good sign. The silence of alphas was a far more dangerous thing than their noise. Tonight, the lie she had so carefully constructed felt brittle, as fragile as dried parchment. Tonight, the silence was coming for her. The summons came not as a polite request, but as a hard rap on her door by a beta guard Bihpag, whose eyes refused to meet hers. His scent was sharp with agitation and a faint underlying note of fear. "The king requires your presence in the great hall, now." He didn't wait for a reply, his heavy boots echoing down the corridor, leaving Marian's heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The great hall. She avoided it whenever possible, a vast cavern of judgment where the weight of 100 powerful gazes could press a wolfless Omega into dust. Walking into it was like willingly stepping into a cage of lions. She smoothed down her simple gray dress, her fingers trembling slightly. The faint stains of cobalt and silver on her fingertips seemed to glow with guilt. She tucked her hands into the folds of her skirt, a useless gesture, and forced her feet to move. The hall was a sea of tension. Torches spat and crackled in their sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that clung to the stone pillars like specters. The pack's highest-ranking members were gathered, their powerful forms radiating an almost visible aura of dominance. The air was thick with the sense of ozone, old leather, and a sharp, metallic undertone of brewing conflict. They stood in tense clusters, their whispers ceasing as she entered, replaced by a wave of cold, assessing stares. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, the rough-hewn flagstones, a map of survival. Do not look up. Do not show fear. Do not exist. "Well, well, look what the shadows have coughed up," a voice drawled, slick with contempt. Marian froze. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Lord Valerius, an alpha of high standing, with a cruel streak as wide as the king's throne. His scent was of frost and smug satisfaction. "The little painter," he continued, stepping into her path. She could feel the heat of him, the sheer predatory force that made the air around him crackle. "Still smudging your little charms on the walls, Omega? Tell me, what color is abject failure?" A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the nearby alphas. Marian's shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that crawled up her neck. She finally forced herself to lift her gaze, meeting his pale, merciless eyes. "My lord," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "My lord," he mimicked, his lip curling. "Such deference from one so empty. The king keeps you as a pet, a curio. A wolfless healer who paints away ailments that a true wolf would simply burn out with their own fire. You are an insult to the moon, a weakness in this court." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, striking the most vulnerable parts of her. She could feel the stares of the others, some laced with pity, most with scornful agreement. She was a flaw in their perfect primal world. A mistake. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some defense, but no words came. What could she say? He was right. The silence inside her was her condemnation. Valerius leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that was meant for everyone to hear. I wonder, does the king know the true extent of your uselessness? Or is he, too, blinded by the pretty colors you use to hide your rot? He reached out, his fingers aiming for her chin, and in that moment, a different kind of silence fell. It was not the expectant hush of a crowd waiting for a final blow. This was a profound, absolute stillness, a sudden vacuum where all sound, all scent, all movement ceased. The torches seemed to dim, the very air growing heavy and cold. The scent hit her first. Ozone and winter pine, the clean, sharp smell of a storm breaking over an ancient forest. It was a scent of undisputed authority, of raw, untamable power that dwarfed every other presence in the room. It was the scent of the king. King Roderick Vane did not stride into the great hall, he manifested. He moved from the shadows near the throne with a predator's silent grace, and the world seemed to reorient itself around him. He was a man built of harsh lines and unforgiving angles, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a kingdom. Scars, pale and silvery, webbed across the strong column of his throat and disappeared beneath the high collar of his black leather tunic. One jagged line cut through his left eyebrow, giving his face a permanent look of severity. But it was his eyes that held the true force of his being. They were the color of a storm-forged sky, gray and turbulent, and they saw everything. He didn't look at Valerius. His gaze swept over the gathered wolves, a silent command that had them bowing their heads and averting their eyes. Valerius's hand, which had been inches from Marian's face, dropped to his side as if scalded. Valerius, the king's voice was not loud, but it resonated in the stones, a low rumble of grinding rock. Have you nothing better to do than torment the court's most fragile assets? The insult was double-edged, dismissing Valerius's cruelty, while simultaneously reminding Marian of her own perceived weakness. Valerius straightened, his arrogance warring with the primal instinct to submit. Your Majesty, I was merely questioning the efficacy of her work. Roderick finally turned his stormy gaze on the other alpha. Her work is under my protection, as is she. Find another hobby. The dismissal was absolute. Valerius's face tightened, but he gave a stiff, jerky bow and retreated, melting back into the crowd of courtiers. The king's attention then settled on Marian. For a long, breathless moment, he just looked at her. It wasn't a look of pity, or contempt, or even curiosity. It was a gaze of unnerving intensity, as if he were trying to peel back the layers of her skin and read the secrets written on her bones. She felt her own carefully constructed walls of invisibility crumble under that scrutiny. He saw her, not the wolfless Omega, not the painter of trinkets, but her. The feeling was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. The spell was broken by a sudden commotion at the main doors. 2 guards burst in, their faces pale, their armor rattling with their haste. Between them, they supported a massive figure, Gideon, the king's first beta and master of arms. Gideon was a mountain of a man, an alpha of immense strength, but now he was slumped, his head lolling, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. A strange dark mottling was visible on his skin, like a bruise spreading from within. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Panic, a sharp and acrid scent, began to cut through the oppressive tension. Poison, someone hissed. It's a curse, another whispered. Roderick was at Gideon's side in an instant, his movements a blur of contained power. He laid a hand on his friend's forehead, his expression hardening into granite. What happened? He demanded of the guards. He just collapsed, Your Majesty, in the armory. One moment he was fine, the next he was on the floor, gasping. One of the guards stammered, his voice tight with fear. Roderick's gaze swept the room again, but this time it was different. It was the look of a king hunting for a traitor in his midst. Every alpha, even Valerius, shifted uncomfortably. This was not a border skirmish or a challenge for dominance. This was a shadow moving within the castle walls, an unseen enemy striking at the heart of the pack. Marian watched, her healer's instincts overriding her fear. She saw the bluish tint to Gideon's lips, the faint tremor in his limbs. It wasn't a poison she recognized, and it felt colder, deeper than any herbal concoction. It felt like magic. like the darkened version of the power she hid in her own blood. As the court physician bustled forward, wringing his hands, King Roderick stood. His movements were slow, deliberate. He turned, his storm-gray eyes scanning the terrified faces of his court. And once again they found Marian. He walked toward her, the crowd parting before him like a tide receding from the shore. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the primal scent of his power. A scent that made the silent thing inside her tremble with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his hand and gently, almost reverently, took one of hers. He turned it over, his thumb brushing over the faint blue and silver stains on her fingers. His touch was not rough, but it was possessive, a claim. It sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock through her system, a spark in the desolate quiet of her soul. His gaze lifted from her hand to her eyes, and the entire world narrowed to the space between them. The whispers, the fear, Gideon's labored breathing, it all faded into a dull roar. "You paint sigils for protection," he stated, his voice a low, intimate rumble that was meant only for her, yet it carried the weight of a royal decree. "You ward against sickness and shadow." It wasn't a question, it was a fact, and a demand. Marian could only nod, her throat too tight to form words. The lie she had lived by was now being called upon to serve. The king's grip on her hand tightened, not painfully, but with an inescapable finality. His eyes held hers, a silent binding oath being forged between the broken Omega and the mighty Alpha King. "From this moment," King Roderick Vane commanded, his voice cutting through the rising panic of the great hall, "your art, your hands, and your secrets belong to the crown. You will not leave my side until this shadow is purged from my court." His words hung in the air, a binding chain forged of sound and authority. Marian's world, once a small gray space defined by the four walls of her room, had just been shattered. "Your secrets belong to the crown." The breath caught in her lungs, a painful, sharp thing. He knew. He couldn't possibly know the truth of her magic, but his words struck so close to the heart of her terror that for a moment, she was certain her carefully painted lies had peeled away, leaving her soul bare for all to see. His grip on her hand was the only thing grounding her. It was a firm, unyielding anchor in a sea of hostile stares and rising panic. He didn't wait for her assent. It was not a request. He began to move, pulling her along in his wake. The powerful alphas and betas of his inner circle, men who would tear apart any lesser wolf for standing in their way, melted aside. They were a force of nature parting for a greater one. Marian stumbled to keep up, her worn leather slippers scuffing silently on the stone. She was a leaf caught in the current of a great river, utterly powerless. They stopped beside the makeshift pallet where Gideon lay. The court physician, a fussy, gray-haired man named Elric, was dabbing at the beta's brow with a uselessly damp cloth, muttering about nightshade vapors and contaminated wine. His scent was of dried herbs and rising fear. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. "Leave him," Roderick commanded. His voice was quiet, but it cut through Elric's nervous chatter like a blade. The physician scrambled back, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. The king knelt beside his fallen friend, his movements fluid and economical, never breaking his hold on Marian's hand. He gently pulled her down with him. The cold of the flagstones seeped into her knees, a mirror of the ice forming in her veins. Up close, Gideon's condition was far worse. The dark mottling on his skin was not a bruise. It seemed to shift subtly beneath the surface, like smoke trapped under glass. His breathing was a faint, wet rasp. The air around him was cold, unnaturally so, carrying a faint, cloying scent of decay, and something else, something metallic and wrong, like rusted iron and wilted lilies. Roderick's stormy eyes met hers. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. He didn't need to speak. The command was in his gaze, in the tightening of his fingers around hers. "Do something, heal him, show me why I have kept you." Panic clawed at her throat. Her sigils were a sham. They were shields for her, not swords for others. They were designed to misdirect, to cloud, to conceal the humming power inside her. How could she possibly turn a lie into a diagnostic tool? It would be like trying to catch moonlight in a sieve. I need my things, she whispered, her voice cracking. My pigments, my brushes. It was the only thing she could think to say, a desperate bid for a moment's reprieve, a retreat to the familiar ritual of her art. The king's gaze didn't waver. He looked over his shoulder. Corvin, he barked. A guard with a jaw like a block of granite stepped forward. Your Majesty. Escort the Lady Marian to her quarters. Bring back everything she requires. No one is to hinder you. No one is to speak to her. He looked back at Marian, his eyes boring into hers. Be quick! The walk back to her small room was a blur of averted eyes and hostile whispers that died the moment Corvin's stony glare passed over them. She felt like a condemned prisoner being led to her own execution. Her room, usually a sanctuary of silence and solitude, felt like a cage. She moved on instinct, her hands trembling as she gathered her worn leather roll of brushes, her small clay pots of powdered pigments, a precious clean square of linen, and a small vial of linseed oil. She hesitated for a fraction of a second over the small silver-bladed knife she used to draw a bead of her own blood. It was the catalyst, the spark that ignited the lie. She snatched it up and tucked it away, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When she returned to the great hall, a wide circle had been cleared around Gideon's still form. The king stood sentinel beside him, a lone mountain against a sky of fear. The rest of the court watched from a distance, their suspicion of palpable force in the air. Lord Valerius was among them, his arms crossed, a smug, predatory smirk on his face. He was waiting for her to fail. He was praying for it. Marian knelt again, laying out her tools on the cold stone. The familiar clink of the clay pots was a small, hollow comfort. She uncorked the vial of oil, the scent filling her senses. She had to do this. She had to create the illusion of healing, a performance for an audience of wolves. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the tremor in her hands. Think. What does a diagnostic sigil look like? She pictured one from an old herbalist's text. A circle for focus, a line for the body, intersecting strokes for the flow of life. It was meaningless, but it had to look authentic. She began to mix her colors. Soot for black, iron oxide for a deep red, crushed malachite for green. But her instincts, the hum of her own magic, screamed at her. These were colors of the earth, of life. The thing clinging to Gideon was none of those. It was a void, a silence, an absence of color, an idea, terrifying and desperate, took hold. What if she didn't paint a lie? What if, for the first time, she tried to paint the truth? What if she didn't try to create a sigil of diagnosis, but instead tried to paint what she felt from the affliction clinging to Gideon? Her gaze flickered to the king. He was watching her every move, his expression unreadable, his presence a crushing weight. There was no choice. Failure meant exposure, exile, or worse. A performance was no longer enough. With a shaking hand, she reached for the pigment pot that held crushed charcoal and ground obsidian. Black, the color of nothingness. She added a drop of oil, mixing it into a thick, glossy paste. Then she picked up the small silver knife. Shielding the motion with her body, she pricked the tip of her thumb. A single perfect droplet of crimson welled up. She let it fall into the black pigment. It vanished, consumed by the darkness. She closed her eyes, focusing not on the crowd, not on the king, but on the coldness radiating from Gideon. She let her senses, the strange non-wolf senses her magic gave her, reach out. She felt the wrongness of it, the cold parasitic energy clinging to the beta's life force, draining it away. It wasn't poison, it was a weaver's knot of malice, a deliberate, magical snare. Her eyes snapped open. She dipped her finest brush into the blood-laced ink. She placed the square of clean linen on the floor beside Gideon's head. Her hand moved, not with the practiced motions of her usual deceptions, but with a new, urgent certainty. She didn't paint the sigil from the book. She painted what she felt. A spiraling, thorny vine, coiling inward on itself, tightening around a core of absolute emptiness. It was ugly, jagged, and wrong. It was the shape of the curse. As she painted the final vicious thorn, the king shifted beside her. He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her, his scent of storm and pine wrapping around her. "What is that?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel directly up her spine. I don't know," she breathed, the honest answer feeling more dangerous than any lie she had ever told. And then it happened. The ink on the linen began to glow. It wasn't the soft, gentle luminescence her concealment sigils sometimes emitted in the dark. This was a stark, sickly, violet light. It pulsed with a weak but malevolent energy, the color of a fresh bruise on a corpse. A horrified gasp rippled through the onlookers. Even Valerius's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The violet light pulsed again, stronger this time, and a thin spectral tendril of the same foul light lifted from the sigil. It hung in the air like a ghostly thread, wavering for a moment before slowly, deliberately beginning to drift away from Gideon, slithering through the air toward the assembled crowd. Marian stared, frozen in a mixture of terror and awe. Her magic had never done this. It had never revealed anything before. It had only ever hidden. By trying to paint the truth of the curse, she had somehow given it a voice, a form. The king's hand shot out, not touching her, but hovering just above her shoulder, a gesture of both protection and warning. He followed the path of the spectral thread with his narrowed, storm-gray eyes. It drifted lazily over the heads of the lesser betas, past the sneering face of Valerius, and continued its slow, inexorable journey toward the back of the hall, toward the deeper shadows near the corridor leading to the royal chambers. Roderick rose to his full, intimidating height, his eyes still locked on the destination of that violet thread. The entire hall held its breath, the silence so complete that the only sound was the ragged whisper of Gideon's struggle for life. The king's gaze dropped back to Marian. The look in his eyes was no longer unreadable. It was sharp, calculating, and held a terrifying new depth of understanding. He had seen her create not a simple charm, but a beacon that tracked dark magic. He had seen the impossible. He leaned down, his face so close to hers that his breath stirred the loose strands of her hair. His voice was a bare whisper, a secret shared in a room full of enemies, a sound that sealed her fate more surely than any iron chain. "That is not the work of a wolfless Omega," he breathed, his stormy eyes locking onto hers, full of suspicion, danger, and a flicker of something she dared not name. "What are you?" His question was a blade held to her throat. "What are you?" It echoed in the vast hollow space inside her, where a wolf should have been. For her entire life, the answer had been simple, brutal, and defining: nothing. A void. A wolfless Omega. But the glowing sigil on the floor, the impossible spectral thread of magic now hovering in the air, screamed a different truth. Marian's mouth was dry, her tongue a leaden weight. Words were useless. Any answer she gave would be a lie, and the truth was a death sentence. Her magic was an abomination in this world of fang and claw. It was the quiet, creeping power of the earth, of blood and intention, something the wolf-bloods had long ago deemed profane and hunted to extinction. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She could only stare up at him, her eyes wide with the terror of a cornered animal. The violet thread of light had stopped its drift. It now hovered, pulsing faintly near the archway leading to the royal wing. It pointed not at a person, but at a direction, a place of power and privilege. The implication was staggering. The source of the curse was not some lowly servant or ambitious courtier in the crowd. It was someone with access to the king's own chambers. Roderick saw it. His face, already a mask of severe control, hardened further. The muscles in his jaw clenched, a subtle, dangerous sign of the rage simmering beneath his iron composure. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping over the silent, terrified faces of his court. The hunt had begun, and the prey was one of them. "Corvin," he commanded, his voice ringing with chilling authority. "Take Lord Gideon to the infirmary. Double the guard. No one enters or leaves without my express permission. Elric," he pinned the trembling physician with a stare, "you will attend him. If his condition worsens, you will answer to me." The two guards and the physician moved with frantic efficiency, lifting the stricken beta and carrying him from the hall. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the crowd as Gideon's fading presence was removed, as if the tangible evidence of the treachery was too much to bear. But the king was not finished. "No one leaves the great hall," he declared, his voice dropping back to that low, rumbling growl that promised violence. "The gates are to be sealed. The castle is on lockdown." He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Lord Valerius, who had been watching the proceedings with a rapt, calculating expression. "Valerius, you and your betas will enforce it. Search every shadow. Valerius's eyes lit with cruel pleasure. He lived for this, the scent of fear, the exercise of power, the breaking of lesser men. He gave a sharp wolfish grin and a curt nod. "As you command, your majesty." He began barking orders, his voice full of the arrogance that Roderick's command had just legitimized. The king's attention returned to Marian. He still stood over her, a formidable wall of muscle and leather, shielding her from the curious, fearful eyes of the court. The glowing sigil on the linen between them cast a sickly purple light on his face, illuminating the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the grim line of his mouth. He reached down, his large, calloused hand closing around her upper arm. His grip was firm, inescapable, but not brutal. He pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. The sudden proximity was dizzying. His scent enveloped her, the wild, clean aroma of pine and storm, overlaid with the sharp, metallic tang of his rising anger. It was overpowering, primal, and it made the hidden magic in her veins hum with a strange, terrifying resonance. It felt like recognition. "You are coming with me," he said, the words a low rumble against her ear. He turned and strode toward the archway, where the spectral thread still hovered, pulling her along with him. The court parted before them once more. Marian kept her eyes down, but she could feel their stares like physical blows. They were no longer looks of simple contempt for a wolfless Omega. Now they were laced with fear and suspicion. She was no longer just a broken thing. She was an unknown quantity, a wielder of strange dark arts, and in this moment, she was the king's chosen instrument. It made her infinitely more dangerous in their eyes. They passed under the stone archway, leaving the tense silence of the great hall behind. The corridor beyond was cool and dim, lit by widely spaced torches. This was the royal wing, a place Marian had never seen, reserved for the king and his most trusted council. The carpets were thick, muffling their footsteps, and the tapestries on the walls depicted glorious hunts and epic battles of the Vane lineage. Here, the air was different. It was saturated with his scent, a permanent mark of his territory. It soaked into the very stone, a constant declaration of his power. Being this deep in his domain felt like being swallowed whole. The violet thread of light moved ahead of them, a ghostly guide leading them down the long corridor. Roderick followed it without hesitation, his grip on her arm unrelenting. His silence was more unnerving than any interrogation. It was a weighted silence, filled with unspoken questions and the palpable thrum of his thoughts. He was assessing her, analyzing the impossible thing he had just witnessed, trying to fit her into a world that had no place for what she was. Marian's mind raced. She had to find a way to explain what had happened, to frame it in a way that wouldn't get her burned as a witch. A fluke? An ancient, forgotten art of her bloodline, harmless and misunderstood? Every excuse she formulated felt thin and pathetic, destined to crumble under the intensity of his gaze. The thread of light finally came to a stop. It hovered before a set of heavy, iron-strapped oak doors, the king's personal chambers. The thread pulsed, weaker now, as if its energy was dissipating, and pointed directly at the door. The curse had been cast from within the king's own sanctuary. Roderick stared at the door, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the faint crackle of a distant torch and the frantic, terrified beating of Marian's own heart. Then he released her arm. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely untethered, the skin of her arm tingling where his fingers had been. He pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside, expecting her to follow. She hesitated for a breath, her feet feeling rooted to the floor. To step into an Alpha King's private chambers was an unthinkable breach of protocol for any Omega, let alone a wolfless one. It was his den, the heart of his power. To enter uninvited was to court death, but his sharp backward glance was all the command she needed. She scurried in after him, feeling smaller and more insignificant than ever. The room was vast, yet Spartan. It was a warrior king's space, not a decadent monarch's. A massive hearth, currently cold, dominated one wall. A large, fur-strewn bed sat on a raised dais. Maps and charts were spread across a heavy wooden table, held down by daggers and polished stones. The air was thick with his scent, so concentrated it was almost suffocating. It was the scent of leather, steel, winter air, and the unique, potent musk of his own wolf. Marian's senses, usually so dull compared to the others, felt overwhelmed. The magic inside her, the part of her that was not human and not wolf, reacted to the sheer density of his power. It was like standing too close to a fire, a thrilling, dangerous heat that threatened to consume her. Roderick ignored her, his stormy eyes scanning every corner of the room. He was a predator in his own territory, searching for the scent of an intruder. He moved with a silent, lethal grace, his hand resting on the pommel of the sword at his hip. He ran his fingers along the edge of his desk, his gaze lingering on a silver chalice, then on a half-written letter. He was looking for anything out of place, any trace of the person who had brought this darkness into his sanctuary. Finally, he turned to her. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping so close she had to crane her neck to look up at him. The sheer size of him was intimidating, a mountain of contained fury. "The sigil," he said, his voice low and hard. "Explain it." Marian swallowed, her throat clicking. I have studied the old arts, the marks of affliction, some illnesses, some poisons. They leave a resonance, a stain on the victim's life force. My pigments, when mixed with a catalyst." She trailed off, unable to bring herself to say blood. "They can sometimes reveal that stain." It was a half-truth, the best she could manage. His eyes narrowed, searching hers for the lie. "No one has practiced those old arts in centuries. They were forbidden. The last of the blood witches were purged during the reign of my grandfather." Blood witches. The name sent a shard of ice through her heart. That was what they called her ancestors. That was the name they had died for. "My family were healers, Your Majesty, not witches," she whispered, the words tasting of ash. "We kept the knowledge, but only for painting, for art. You never thought to mention that you could track curses through my castle?" he finished for her, his voice dripping with dangerous sarcasm. "I didn't know I could." The words burst out of her, raw and honest. "I have never seen magic like this. I only ever used my art to create wards, protections. I was trying to see the shape of the illness and it responded." He stared at her for a long, tense moment, the silence stretching until it was a physical strain. He was weighing her words, weighing her. He was the alpha of alphas, his instincts honed to a razor's edge. He could surely scent the lie clinging to her, the deeper secret she was still trying to protect. But instead of calling her out, he reached out and took her hand, the one with the small, weeping pinprick on the thumb. He turned it over, his gaze fixed on the tiny bead of blood. His thumb brushed over it, gently smearing the crimson drop. A jolt, hot and electric, shot up her arm. It was not the shock of fear or surprise. It was something else entirely, something primal and terrifyingly new. A connection, a spark jumping between his raw, wolfish power and her hidden, earthy magic. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt. His scent filled her lungs, not just pine and storm, but something deeper, richer, the smell of hot blood and ancient soil, and a possessiveness that stole her breath. The silent, hollow place inside her ached. It was a sharp, piercing pang of longing for something she'd never had, a phantom limb crying out for a connection it was never meant to feel. He felt it too. She saw it in his eyes, a flicker of shock, a widening of his pupils. His nostrils flared, and he drew in a sharp breath, as if tasting her scent on the air for the very first time. He dropped her hand as if it had burned him, taking a step back. The connection was severed, leaving a strange, cold emptiness in its wake. The air between them crackled with a new, unspoken tension. It was no longer just the tension between a king and his subject, an alpha and an omega, a hunter and his potential prey. It was something far more ancient, something that defied the rigid laws of their world. Roderick turned away from her abruptly, running a hand through his dark hair. He was shaken. The unshakable King Roderick Vane, the Wolf of the North, was shaken by the touch of his wolfless painter. The realization gave Marian no comfort, only a fresh wave of terror. "The curse was cast from this room," he said, his voice rough, forced back into the familiar cadence of command. Someone was here, someone who had access. He began to pace, the restless energy of his wolf finally breaking through his control. "Only a handful have that. My counsel, my personal guard, Valerius." He stopped, his back to her. "And you." The accusation was soft, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. Me? She gasped, horrified. No, I would never. You are the only one in this castle who has just demonstrated an affinity for this kind of magic. He shot back, turning to face her again, his eyes blazing with suspicion. You appeared in my court 5 years ago, a refugee from a burned-out village, claiming to be nothing more than a painter. You have been quiet, unseen, the perfect spy, the perfect assassin. Every word was a nail in her coffin. He was laying out the facts, and they formed a picture of perfect guilt. Her terror warred with a sudden, hot surge of indignation. He thought she was the traitor? After a lifetime of cowering, of hiding, of being nothing, he thought she possessed the will and the power to strike down the king's most powerful beta. If I were the traitor, she said, her voice shaking but clear, why would I create a sigil that exposed the magic? Why would I lead you right to the heart of the conspiracy? Perhaps to frame someone else, he countered, his logic as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. To sow chaos, to point the finger away from your true masters. The injustice of it stole her breath. He stood there, a king cloaked in power and certainty, while she stood in the ruins of her life's great lie, with nothing to defend herself but the truth he was determined not to believe. A tear of pure, helpless frustration welled in her eye. She angrily brushed it away. She would not cry. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She lifted her chin, meeting his stormy, accusatory gaze with one of her own. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a wolfless Omega. She felt like Marion Lurwin, a woman wrongly accused, and a flicker of defiance ignited in her soul. "Then you are a fool, Your Majesty," she said, the words tasting like rebellion and freedom. His eyes widened in shock. No one spoke to him that way. No one. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the promise of his wrath. His powerful form tensed, and a low, guttural growl started deep in his chest. It was the sound of primal fury, the prelude to a kill. But Marion held her ground, her heart hammering. Her defiance a fragile shield against his rage. Let him strike her down. Let him end it. It was better than being his pawn, his pet, his prime suspect in a game she didn't understand. The growl subsided, though the fury still burned in his eyes. He stared at her, the silence stretching, and in that silence, something shifted. He saw not a traitor, not a witch, but the raw, desperate courage of a woman with nothing left to lose. And in his eyes, the suspicion did not vanish, but it was joined by a grudging, dangerous flicker of respect. He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them once more. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, dangerous whisper that promised no safety, only a stay of execution. Prove it, 2 words. A challenge and a death sentence entwined. How could she prove her innocence when the very magic that might exonerate her was the source of his suspicion? It was a serpent eating its own tail, a trap with no exit. Marion stood frozen in the king's chambers, the echo of his command sealing the doors of her world, locking her inside this gilded cage with the wolf who held the key. His anger had receded, banked like embers under a layer of ash, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity that was somehow more terrifying. He was no longer a beast of rage. He was a hunter, patient and watchful, and she was the strange, unknown creature in his sights. How? She finally managed to ask, her voice a fragile thread in the heavy silence. You believe my magic makes me a traitor. How can I use it to prove I am not? You will recreate the sigil, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Here, now, but this time, you will not paint what you feel from the victim. You will paint a sigil of truth, a sigil that can show us not just the trail of the magic, but the hand that cast it. Marion stared at him aghast. There is no such thing. I cannot simply invent a spell. My art doesn't work that way. It reflects what is there. It doesn't create what is not. Then you will learn, he said, his voice flat and unforgiving. He turned and walked to the massive oak table, sweeping the maps and daggers aside with one powerful arm. They clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense room. He gestured to the now clear surface. Your canvas. This was madness. He was asking her to perform a miracle, to pull a specific targeted revelation out of the chaotic ether of her untamed abilities. The magic in her veins was a wild, intuitive thing, a river without a rudder. He was demanding she build a dam and direct its flow with the precision of an engineer. Failure was not an option, it was a certainty, and the consequences of that failure would be absolute. With trembling hands, she retrieved the linen square with the now faded violet sigil. She laid out her pots of pigment on his table, the simple clay tools looking wretched and out of place on the polished ancient wood. Her heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm. Think, a sigil of truth, what would that even look like? All her art was based on concealment, on layers of illusion. To reverse that, to create something that stripped away lies. It felt like trying to unweave a tapestry thread by thread. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the overwhelming presence of the king, who stood watching her, his arms crossed over his massive chest. She tried to focus on the concept of truth. What was its shape? Its color? A straight line, perhaps? The pure, clean white of chalk? The brilliant gold of the sun? Her instincts, the quiet hum of her power, rejected all of it. Truth, her magic seemed to whisper, was not simple or clean. It was complex, often painful. It was not a color, but the absence of shadow. An idea began to form, a desperate, dangerous gamble. Her concealment sigils worked by layering pigments infused with her blood magic to create a shield. What if she did the opposite? What if she used a purifying agent, something to strip away the layers and let her blood reveal whatever was underneath? She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the silver chalice on the king's desk. It was filled with wine, dark and red. Not what she needed. She scanned the room, her eyes darting over shelves of books, weapon racks, chests of clothes. Her gaze landed on a simple ceramic basin and pitcher in the corner, filled with clean water for his morning ablutions. "I need salt," she said, her voice barely audible. Roderick raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Salt?" "To purify," she improvised, the lie forming on her lips even as a deeper, instinctive part of her knew it was the right ingredient. "To cleanse the canvas of any lingering energies." He stared at her for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod. He strode to the door and spoke a low command to the guards outside. A few moments later, a servant appeared with a small stone bowl of coarse sea salt, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. Refusing to look at Marian as he placed it on the table and backed away as if she were a venomous snake. Marian took a deep breath. This was it. She poured a small amount of water from the pitcher into a clean bowl, then added a pinch of salt, stirring it with the wooden handle of a brush. The salt dissolved, creating a clear, purified liquid. She then took a fresh square of linen, laying it on the table. She dipped a wide, soft brush into the salt water and painted a simple, broad circle onto the fabric. It was invisible, a layer of pure potential. Now for the hard part. She needed the catalyst, her blood, and she needed the medium to carry it. This time, the dark obsidian ink felt wrong. It was the color of curses, of secrets. To reveal, she needed a conduit, something that held no color of its own. She reached for a pot of clear, viscous gum arabic, a binder she sometimes used to give her pigments a glossy finish. She pricked her thumb again, the sting a familiar, sharp reality. She squeezed a single drop of blood into the thick gum, stirring it quickly. The blood did not vanish this time. It remained suspended, a crimson thread swirling in the clear medium, like a memory trapped in amber. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold the brush. She could feel the king's gaze on her, a physical pressure. She dipped the finest tipped brush into the blood-laced gum and leaned over the salted linen. She had no image in her head, no ancient text to guide her. She had only the raw, desperate intention. Show me the truth. Show me the hand that casts the shadow. She touched the brush to the center of the invisible saltwater circle. She didn't paint a thorny vine or a complex knot. She painted a single, stark symbol, an open eye. It was a simple, almost crude shape, but she poured all of her focus, all of her will, into the stroke. It was a plea to her own power, a demand for clarity in a world of lies. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The symbol of the eye, a faint reddish swirl on the damp linen, simply sat there. A cold dread washed over Marian. She had failed. Her gamble had been for nothing. She could feel a triumphant sneer forming on Valerius's face. Even though he was a corridor away, she could feel the king's disappointment hardening into a death sentence. Then the king took a sharp, audible breath. Marian looked up from the sigil to his face. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the far wall of the chamber, his eyes wide with disbelief. She followed his gaze. The stone wall beside the hearth, a solid, unremarkable expanse of gray granite, was shimmering. The light was not coming from her sigil. Her sigil was acting as a lens, a focal point. It was bending the ambient light in the room, projecting a distorted, wavering image onto the stone. It was like looking at a reflection in a disturbed pool of water. Slowly, agonizingly, the image began to resolve. Shadows coalesced, taking on forms. It was this room, the king's chamber, but seen from a strange, dislocated perspective. As if viewed through the eyes she had painted, she could see the edge of the great table, the hearth, the corner of the fur-strewn bed. And there was a figure. It was a man, his back mostly to them, shrouded in a dark, hooded cloak that obscured his features. He was standing where Marian now stood, at the table. His hands, covered in dark leather gloves, were performing some sort of ritual. A small dark bowl sat on the table, and he was grinding something in it with a pestle. A faint, sickly violet smoke, the exact color of the light from her first sigil, rose from the bowl. Marian's breath hitched. It was him, the traitor, the curse weaver. "Who is it?" Roderick's voice was a low growl, vibrating with contained fury. He moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, their attention locked on the ghostly scene unfolding on the wall. "Can you make it clearer?" I don't know," she whispered, her own heart pounding with a mixture of terror and vindication. She stared at the sigil on the table, the simple, blood-laced eye. She pushed more of her energy into it, more of her will. "See his face. Show us his face." On the wall, the image wavered violently. The cloaked figure seemed to sense something. He stopped his grinding and slowly, as if moving through deep water, he began to turn. Marian held her breath. The king's entire body was coiled like a spring, every muscle tense. He was a wolf, poised to leap. The figure on the wall turned, the shadows of the hood falling across his face, keeping his identity agonizingly hidden. But then he lifted a gloved hand and pushed the hood back. The face that was revealed was not one Marian recognized at first. It was a pale, severe face, with thin lips and eyes that were cold and empty. But then she saw the small, crescent-shaped scar just below his left ear, a scar she had seen dozens of times in the Great Hall. It was Lord Elian, a quiet, unassuming alpha from a lesser house, who was a member of the king's own council, one of the handful of men who had unrestricted access to this chamber. A low, visceral snarl ripped from Roderick's throat. It was not a human sound. It was the pure, undiluted rage of a betrayed wolf. The sound hit Marian with physical force, a wave of primal fury that made her knees weak. The scent of his anger flooded the room, thick and suffocating. On the wall, the vision began to dissolve. The image of Lord Elian flickered and broke apart like smoke, the magical echo of his presence fading. The shimmering on the stone ceased, leaving only the cold, hard reality of what they had seen. Marian stumbled back from the table, her strength failing her. She had done it. She had proven it wasn't her. But the victory felt hollow, swallowed by the terrifying magnitude of the king's wrath. Roderick did not look at her. His stormy eyes were fixed on the spot where the image had been, burning with a cold, murderous fire. He was a monolith of vengeance, his knuckles white where he gripped the hilt of his sword. The betrayal cut deep. Lord Elian was not just a council member. He was a man Roderick had trusted, had shared meals with, had fought beside. "They will pay," he bit out, the words seeming to be torn from his very soul. "They will all pay." He turned then, his burning gaze finally falling on her. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something far more complex and dangerous: awe, reluctance, and a possessiveness that was terrifying in its intensity. He had seen the truth of her power, and he understood in that moment what a weapon she could be, what an asset she was. He strode toward her, his fury coiling into a tight, focused point. He stopped directly in front of her, crowding her against the edge of the table. He reached out, not to her arm, but to her face. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle as they brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His thumb rested just below her eye, a gesture of unnerving intimacy. "You have proven you are not the traitor," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "But you have also proven that you are far more than you seem." His scent was overwhelming, a vortex of power and rage and something else. something wilder that was aimed directly at her. His wolf was at the surface, drawn out by the betrayal and the raw display of her magic. His eyes, turbulent and gray, locked onto hers. The pupil of his left eye, the one with the scar above it, seemed to dilate, turning almost black. It was a sign of the wolf's ascendance, a mark of his claim. "Your secrets are no longer your own, Marian Lurwyn," he breathed, his thumb stroking her skin, sending a shiver of mingled fear and impossible longing through her. "They are mine, your magic is mine, and from this day forward, you are mine to protect, and mine to command." He leaned closer, his lips hovering inches from hers. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the scent of the storm and the heat of his body. Her own magic, her own soul, seemed to rise up to meet him, a silent, helpless answer to his primal declaration. He was not asking, he was not offering. He was claiming her, and every instinct she possessed, human and otherwise, screamed in terrified, exultant surrender. His words were a brand, searing themselves into her soul. Mine. The world tilted, narrowing to the turbulent storm in his eyes, the heat of his breath on her skin, the possessive weight of his hand against her face. A wild, terrified part of her wanted to recoil, to run, to disappear back into the comfortable gray shadows of her former life. But another part of her, a deeper, more ancient part, that had been dormant and starved for an eternity, leaned into his touch. It was a sun-starved flower turning its face toward a forest fire, knowing it would be consumed, but craving the warmth all the same. The silence inside her, the hollow ache of her wolflessness, was for a single breathless moment, filled with the roar of his wolf, and it felt terrifyingly like coming home. His head lowered, the last inch of space between them evaporating. His scent was a heady intoxication of power and pine, a promise of both ruin and sanctuary. Her eyelids fluttered closed, a silent act of surrender. This was the end of her life as a ghost. This was the beginning of something else. A thunderous, frantic pounding on the chamber doors shattered the moment. "Your Majesty!" a voice bellowed from the corridor, rough with urgency. "King Roderick, we have a breach in the West Wing. Lord Ellion's quarters are ablaze." Roderick flinched back as if struck, the spell broken. A guttural snarl of pure frustration tore from his chest. He took a half step away from Marian, and the sudden cold was a physical shock. The king was back, the primal wolf forced back into its cage behind a mask of cold fury. The brief, searing connection was severed, leaving Marian trembling and exposed, her heart hammering against her ribs for an entirely different reason. "He knows," Roderick bit out, his stormy eyes locking with hers for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the truth they had uncovered. He strode to the door and threw it open. Corvan stood there, his face grim, flanked by two other guards in full armor. "He is trying to destroy the evidence," the king stated, his voice a blade of ice. "Valerius and his betas are to surround the West Wing. No one gets out. Send a team to contain the fire, but their priority is capture, not rescue. I want him alive." He looked back at Marian, his gaze pinning her in place. "You, with me." He didn't wait for an answer. He swept out into the corridor, a whirlwind of vengeful authority, and Marian had no choice but to hurry after him, her small pot of blood-laced gum clutched in her hand like a talisman. The castle was in an uproar. Guards were running, their boots echoing on the stone, their scents sharp with adrenaline. Courtiers peered from doorways, their faces pale with fear and confusion. As Marian followed in the king's wake, their eyes fell on her. The whispers were no longer just scornful. They were laced with a new, potent fear. She was the witch at the king's heel, the omen of the unfolding chaos. They reached the West Wing to find it choked with thick, acrid smoke. Flames licked at the tapestries outside Lord Ellion's apartments, and the air was hot and difficult to breathe. Valerius was already there, directing his men with a savage glee, his wolfish grin illuminated by the firelight. "Majesty," he barked, giving a sharp bow. "We have him cornered. He's barricaded himself inside." "Then break the door down," Roderick commanded, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. Two massive betas lowered their shoulders and slammed into the heavy oak door. It groaned, splintering, but held. As they prepared for a second charge, Marian felt a strange sensation, a cold spot in the overwhelming heat. It was a faint, prickly feeling on her skin, emanating from the door itself. It was magic. A desperate, hastily constructed ward. "Wait!" she cried out, her voice thin in the chaos. Roderick, who had been focused on the door, turned his head, his expression annoyed. "What is it?" "There's a sigil," she said, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "On the inside. A ward of repulsion. It's weak, but it's reinforcing the wood." Valerius scoffed. "More of your painter's fantasies, Omega? It's a door. Break it." But Roderick was not looking at Valerius. He was looking at Marion. His eyes narrowed in assessment. He had seen what her magic could do. He strode to the door, ignoring the heat, and placed his palm flat against the wood. He closed his eyes for a moment, his nostrils flaring. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "She's right," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He opened his eyes, and they glowed with a faint silvery light, the power of his wolf rising to meet the challenge. "There is a foul energy here." He stepped back. "All of you, stand aside." Valerius and the guards retreated, their expressions a mixture of confusion and awe. Roderick drew his sword. The blade was a magnificent piece of craftsmanship, its steel humming with an almost imperceptible energy. He took a deep breath, and the air around him seemed to grow colder, charged with ozone. He was not just a king, a warrior. He was an alpha of an ancient, powerful line, and his own blood held a magic that was raw, wild, and utterly dominant. He lunged forward, not with the brute force of his betas, but with a single, precise, impossibly powerful thrust. The tip of his sword struck the center of the door. There was a sound like shattering glass, and a flash of sickly violet light exploded outwards. The magical ward disintegrated, its energy spent. The oak door, now stripped of its unnatural reinforcement, blew apart into a shower of splinters. Roderick strode through the breach into the smoke-filled room without hesitation. Marion followed, coughing, her eyes streaming. The room was a wreck. Papers and books were burning in the hearth, a desperate attempt to erase all traces of guilt. And in the center of the room, surrounded by a ring of overturned furniture, stood Lord Elian. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming courtier. His fine clothes were singed, his face streaked with soot, and his eyes were wide with the feral panic of a trapped animal. He held a long, wicked-looking dagger, its blade coated in the same dark, oily substance she had seen him grinding in her vision. "Stay back!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. He waved the dagger wildly at the guards who were beginning to file into the room. Roderick stopped, holding up a hand to halt his men. He stood tall and immovable amidst the smoke and chaos, his sword held loosely at his side. "It is over, Elian. You are accused of high treason and the use of forbidden magic against a member of my council. Surrender now, and your death will be swift." Elian laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Surrender to you, after you cast me aside, after you ignored my counsel and my house in favor of brutes like Valerius?" His wild eyes darted around the room, finally landing on Marion, who was half hidden behind the king. A look of pure, venomous hatred twisted his features. "And you," he spat, pointing the poisoned dagger at her. "The little wolfless witch. This is your doing. You crawled into his head with your filthy blood magic and painted your lies." He took a step forward. "You think you've won? You think he trusts you? You are his new pet, his tool. He will use you until your magic runs dry, and then he will discard you like the broken thing you are." Roderick moved so fast he was a blur. He closed the distance between them in a single step, his sword a flash of silver. He did not aim to kill. The flat of his blade slammed into Elian's wrist with brutal force. A sickening crack echoed through the room, and the dagger clattered to the floor. Elian screamed, clutching his shattered arm. The guards surged forward, subduing him and binding his hands before he could even draw another breath. Through it all, Roderick did not take his eyes off the captured traitor, but Marion felt the shift in his posture. He had moved, almost unconsciously, to place his body more fully between her and Elian, a living shield against the man's accusations. Elian's words, meant to sow discord, had done the opposite. They had forced the king into a public act of protection. As Elian was dragged away, still screaming curses and accusations, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. The fire was being contained. The immediate danger was over, but Marion was left shaking, Elian's words ringing in her ears. He will use you, and then he will discard you. Was that her future? To be the king's weapon, celebrated in one moment and condemned in the next? Roderick turned to her, his face a grim, unreadable mask. The silvery light had faded from his eyes, leaving only the cold gray of a winter storm. "Come," was all he said. He did not lead her back to her own chambers, or even to his. He led her down into the cold, damp depths of the castle, to the dungeons. The air grew heavy and smelled of wet stone, despair, and old fear. Torches cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, and the silence was broken only by the drip of water and the distant, mournful groan of a rusted hinge. Lord Elian was chained to the wall in the central interrogation cell. His face was pale, his earlier defiance crumbling into sullen silence. He refused to look at the king. Roderick circled him like a wolf stalking its prey. "You poisoned my first beta. You practiced forbidden arts within the walls of my own keep. You conspired against the crown. I want to know who you were working with. I want names." Elian just shook his head, a faint, bitter smile on his lips. "You will get nothing from me, Roderick." The king's control finally snapped. He seized the front of Elian's tunic, slamming him back against the stone wall with enough force to make his teeth rattle. "You think you have a choice?" he roared, his voice bouncing off the damp stone, his wolf finally unleashed. "I will tear the truth from your throat with my own hands." But Elian, for all his cowardice, held firm. "Kill me then, you will still know nothing." Roderick released him in disgust, turning away to pace the small cell. His frustration was a palpable force, a storm trapped in a bottle. He stopped, his back to Elian, and his gaze fell on Marion, who had been standing silently in the doorway, a ghost in this chamber of violence. A new, chilling idea began to form in his eyes. He looked from her to her pot of blood-lace gum, and then to the defiant prisoner. His expression was terrible to behold, a mixture of ruthless desperation and cold, pragmatic logic. He was a king pushed to the edge, and he was about to use the sharpest weapon in his arsenal. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the dreadful silence. He stopped before her, his large frame blocking out the torchlight from the corridor, casting her in his shadow. "You said your magic reflects what is there," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You showed me a shadow of the past, a memory left on the air." Marion nodded, her throat too dry to speak. "I need more than a memory now," he continued, his eyes boring into hers. "I need what is inside his head. I need his allegiance, his co-conspirators, his secrets." A cold, sickening dread uncoiled in Marion's stomach. She knew what he was going to ask. She could feel the words forming before he even spoke them. "You created a sigil to see the truth," King Roderick Vane commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth, all humanity, leaving only the unyielding will of a monarch. "Now you will create one to extract it. Place your linen upon his skin, use your blood, paint his confession onto the page for me to read." Marion stared at him in horror. He was asking her to violate a mind, to use her power not as a shield or a lens, but as a scalpel. It was a dark, twisted perversion of her art, a path she had never, ever imagined treading. It was the work of a blood witch. She looked from the king's merciless face to Elian's terrified one. This was her choice. Refuse her king and be branded a traitor herself, or become the monster everyone had always believed her to be. Her hand holding her brush began to tremble uncontrollably. The silence in the dungeon was a living thing. It pressed in on Marion, heavy and suffocating, thick with the scent of wet stone, fear, and the king's unyielding demand. Paint his confession. The words were a desecration. Her magic, the secret, shameful core of her being, had always been a tool of defense, of concealment. He was asking her to turn it into an instrument of violation, to peel back the layers of a man's mind and lay his soul bare for the world to see. Elian, chained to the wall, began to struggle, his eyes wide with a new, profound terror. He had faced the king's physical wrath, but this was something else entirely. This was a threat to his very sanity, his self. "No," he whimpered, shaking his head frantically. "You can't. That is an abomination." His words struck Marion like a physical blow because they were true. This was the dark path her ancestors had been accused of treading. the very reason her kind had been hunted into oblivion. To do this would be to become the monster of their history books. She looked at Roderick, her eyes pleading. "Your Majesty, I don't know how. My magic has never been an attack." "Then you will make it one," he replied, his voice a low, immutable growl. The man who had almost kissed her, the protector who had shielded her from Elian's accusations, was gone. In his place was the Wolf King, a ruler who would burn the world to protect his throne, his pack. His stormy eyes held no pity, only ruthless pragmatism. "He is a cancer in my court. You are the knife that will cut him out. Do it, or your own loyalties will be called into question." The threat was clear, as sharp and cold as the dungeon air. She was trapped. To refuse was to align herself with the traitor. To obey was to sacrifice a piece of her own soul. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, she stepped forward. The guards held Elian still as he thrashed against his chains. Marian avoided his terrified gaze, focusing instead on the patch of skin on his forehead. Her heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She uncorked the small pot of blood-laced gum Arabic, the clear medium seeming to mock her with its purity. This was a filthy, ugly act. She laid a clean square of linen on a small, nearby stool. She dipped her brush, the bristles trembling, and hesitated. What was the shape of a confession? The symbol of an open eye had revealed a memory. To pull forth a secret, to extract it, she imagined a key, a hook, something that could reach inside and draw out the truth. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus, to push past the revulsion and find the intuitive hum of her power. She pictured Elian's mind as a locked chest. She poured her will into the brush, not asking to see, but asking to open. She painted a complex, spiraling symbol, like a key forged of thorns, designed to unlock and ensnare. She took the small painted linen and turned back to the prisoner. "Hold him," she whispered to the guards, her voice hoarse. She reached out, her fingers shaking, and pressed the damp linen against Elian's forehead. The moment it made contact, he screamed. It was not a scream of pain, but of pure psychic agony. His body went rigid, his eyes rolling back in his head. A violent tremor racked his frame. At the same time, a jolt of raw, chaotic energy surged back up Marian's arm. It was a torrent of sensation: fear, hatred, ambition, paranoia, glimpses of clandestine meetings in dark corridors, the glint of coin, the whispered name of a foreign lord. It was too much, a psychic scream that threatened to overwhelm her. She cried out, snatching her hand back as if burned. The linen fell to the floor. The sigil on the linen was no longer a clear, clean spiral. It was now a chaotic, spider-webbed mess of black and crimson lines, bleeding outwards from the center. It was a map of a poisoned mind, a tapestry of treason. Elian slumped against his chains, unconscious, a thin line of spittle on his lips. Marian stumbled back, falling against the cell wall, gasping for breath. The psychic backlash left her dizzy and nauseous. She had not just seen his secrets, she had felt them. She had tasted his venomous jealousy, his burning resentment. The filth of it clung to her, a stain on her spirit. Roderick was at her side in an instant. His hands gripped her shoulders, steadying her. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice urgent. "Names," she gasped, pressing the heels of her hands to her temples, trying to block out the echoing chaos. A banner, a black wolf on a field of red. Lord Valerius. He was there, in the memory. He was listening. The king went utterly still. His grip on her shoulders tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Valerius?" he breathed. The name of venomous hiss. The implication was devastating. Valerius, his most ambitious and cruel alpha, was not the mastermind, but he was aware of the plot. He had stood by, watching, waiting to see if Elian's curse would succeed, ready to claim the spoils in the ensuing chaos. Roderick released her and turned to face the corridor. "Corvin," he roared, "find Lord Valerius. Bring him to the throne room. Use any force necessary." The order was given with the chilling finality of a death sentence. He turned back to Marian. The fury in his eyes was a terrifying inferno, but as his gaze fell on her pale, trembling form, something else flickered in their depths. The pragmatic king receded, and for a moment, the man returned. He saw not the weapon, but the woman he had forced to wield it. He saw the cost of his command written on her face, He reached out, his hand surprisingly gentle, and tilted her chin up. His thumb brushed across her cheek. A gesture of unexpected tenderness. "You are pale," he murmured, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "The backlash. It harms you." She could only nod, the foul remnants of Elian's mind still swirling in her head. "This is my fault," he said, the admission seemingly torn from him. "I commanded this. I forced your hand." He looked from her face to his own hand, still resting on her skin, and a strange look passed over his face. "There is a bond between us now, forged in this darkness. I feel it. My wolf. It recognizes you. It has since the moment you made the truth appear on that cloth." Marian's breath hitched. She felt it too. It was a thin, shimmering thread connecting the raw, primal power of his wolf to the quiet, earthy magic inside her. It was terrifying and undeniable. His wolf didn't see her as wolfless. It saw her as something other, something that answered its own power. "I need you," he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming intensely personal, a confession in the heart of the dungeon. "I need your sight, your truth, but I will not see you destroyed by it." He led her from the dungeons, his hand moving from her chin to the small of her back, a possessive, protective gesture. He did not take her to the throne room, where Valerius would soon be facing his judgment. He led her back to the quiet sanctuary of his own chambers. Inside, the air was still thick with his scent, but now it was a comfort rather than a threat. He guided her to a chair near the cold hearth, then poured 2 goblets of deep red wine from the silver chalice on his desk. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact sent a fresh jolt through her, but this time it was not a shock of violation or command. It was a spark of warmth that chased away some of the dungeon's chill. He did not sit. He paced before the hearth, a caged wolf, the weight of the new betrayal heavy on his broad shoulders. "Valerius," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "He would let the kingdom burn if he could rule over the ashes. I should have seen it." He stopped his pacing and looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a raw vulnerability she had never expected to see. "You are the only one in this castle I can trust. A wolfless Omega with the power to see through lies. The irony is a cruel one. The magic. It takes a toll," she whispered, her voice still shaky. "The more I use it, the more I feel." He nodded, his gaze dropping to her hands, which were still trembling around the stem of the goblet. He walked over to her and knelt before her chair, a startling act of humility from a king. He took her free hand in both of his. His palms were warm and calloused, engulfing her smaller, slighter hand. "Show me," he said softly. "Show me the price." Hesitantly, she reached out with her senses, not to attack or reveal, but simply to connect. She let him feel the faint, echoing nausea, the lingering psychic stain of Elian's hatred. She let him feel the hollow emptiness inside her, the constant aching silence where her own wolf should have been. A pained grunt escaped his lips, and his grip on her hand tightened. His eyes, now level with hers, were filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. He was not just seeing her weakness, he was feeling it. "By the moon," he breathed, "to live with that silence, and to bear the clamor of others' souls on top of it. It is a terrible burden." In that moment, he was not her king. He was not her master. He was simply a man, seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. The last of her defenses crumbled. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. He lifted his free hand and gently wiped the tear away with his thumb. His touch lingered. The distance between them shrank again, the air growing thick with unspoken words and undeniable need. He had used her, he had hurt her, but he had also seen her, and in this world of wolves where she had always been invisible, to be seen was a powerful, irresistible balm. "Marian," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. His gaze dropped to her mouth. "Forgive me." He leaned in, his intent clear, his face blurring as he closed the final inches between them. This time there would be no interruption, no summons, no fire. There was only the cold room, the scent of wine and winter pine, and the collision of 2 broken souls, a king burdened by betrayal and a healer wounded by the truths she was forced to uncover. The bond of scars, both visible and unseen, was about to be sealed. His lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of desperation and need, a raw, almost violent expression of the chaos that raged within him. It tasted of wine and betrayal, of a king's fury and a man's contrition. Marion gasped into his mouth, a sound of shock and surrender. His arms enveloped her, one hand tangling in her hair, tilting her head back, while the other slid from her hand to her waist, pulling her from the chair and onto her knees before him, pressing her body flush against his. The world dissolved into a storm of sensation. The rough texture of his leather tunic against her cheek, the possessive strength of his arms, the overwhelming scent of him filling her lungs, her mind, her soul. It was a drowning, a consumption. The magic in her veins, so recently violated by Elian's psychic filth, now surged in response to the king's raw power. It was not a call to battle, but a song of recognition, a primal harmony between his wolf and her earth-bound core. The hollow space inside her ached with a ferocious, impossible longing. He broke the kiss, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his forehead resting against hers. His stormy eyes, now dark with passion, bored into hers. "Marion," he rasped, his voice thick with an emotion that was equal parts reverence and hunger. He was looking at her as if he had been starving his entire life and had just been presented with a feast. He kissed her again, deeper this time. A thorough exploration that staked a claim on her very essence. Her hands, which had been trapped between them, came up to grip his shoulders, her fingers digging into the hard muscle as she returned his kiss with a desperate intensity that mirrored his own. For the first time in her life, she was not hiding. She was not a ghost or a lie. In the arms of this dangerous, tormented king, she was terrifyingly, incandescently real. A sharp, violent tremor suddenly racked his body. He pulled back with a choked cry of pain, his hands flying to his chest. His face, which had been flushed with passion, contorted in agony. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the front of his black tunic, blossoming from the center of his chest. It was wet and crimson, blood. "Roderick!" she cried, her own passion turning to ice-cold terror. He stumbled back, falling into a sitting position on the floor, his back against the leg of the heavy oak table. He looked down at the spreading stain, then up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "The chalice!" he gasped, his gaze flicking to the silver goblet he had been drinking from, which now lay on its side on the floor, its remaining contents a dark puddle on the stone. Poison. It hadn't been for Gideon, not originally. The curse on Gideon had been a test, a distraction. The true target had always been the king. Marion scrambled to his side, her mind racing. The physician was useless, the castle was in chaos. She was the only one here. Her hands went to the fastenings of his tunic, her fingers fumbling with the leather ties. She had to see the wound, the point of entry. But there was no wound. The blood wasn't coming from him. It was weeping through his skin, a dark, unnatural sweat of pure crimson. It was the same as Gideon, but 1,000 times faster, 1,000 times more potent. The curse had found its true mark. My pigments," she stammered, looking wildly around the room. Her tools were still on the table. She crawled over to them, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the pots. "No," Roderick grunted, his voice already growing weaker. He was leaning heavily against the table, his powerful body slumping. "Too slow. Elian's magic is anchored to me. He is the caster, the source." She understood. The curse was a living thing, a tether between the caster and the victim. As long as Elian lived, the curse would draw its strength from him, feeding on his malice and pouring its venom into Roderick. To save the king, she had to break the connection. She had to kill the source. She looked from Roderick's pain-contorted face to the door. The dungeons. She had to get back to the dungeons. "I'll be back," she promised, her voice tight with terror. She started for the door, but his hand shot out, his grip surprisingly strong, and seized her wrist. "Don't kill him," he forced out, his breathing becoming shallow. "If he dies, the tether breaks, but the poison remains. It will consume me. You must sever it, not shatter it. Sever it, not shatter it." It was a puzzle wrapped in a death sentence. How could she possibly sever a magical connection? Her power was intuitive, chaotic, not precise. She was a painter, not a surgeon. His grip on her wrist weakened, his eyes beginning to glaze over. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She was going to lose him. This man who had claimed her, who had seen her, who had ignited a fire in the desolate landscape of her soul. She was going to watch him die on the floor of his own chambers. A primal rage, utterly foreign to her, rose up from the depths of her being. No, she would not let this happen. The quiet, wolfless Omega, the painter of lies, was gone. In her place was a woman fighting for the life of her king, her mate. The words sprang into her mind, unbidden and terrifyingly true. Her soul, in the absence of a wolf, had recognized his. Her gaze fell on his sword, lying on the floor where he'd dropped it when he'd first been struck by the poison. An idea, born of sheer, mad desperation, took hold. His bloodline held power. His sword was an extension of that power. It had shattered Elian's ward. Perhaps it could cut his magic as well. She snatched up the heavy blade. The steel was cold but thrummed with a latent energy, a faint hum that resonated with her own magic. She looked at Roderick, at the blood now soaking his tunic, the life draining from him. Then she looked at the door. There was no time. She had to bring the source to the victim. "Guards!" she screamed, her voice raw with a power she didn't know she possessed. "Guards!" The doors burst open. Corvin and another guard stood there, their swords drawn, their eyes wide at the scene before them. The king dying on the floor, and the wolfless Omega holding his sword. "Bring me the prisoner," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that was not her own. It was a reflection of the king's, a borrowed power that came from the bond he had forged with her. "Bring Lord Elian here, now!" Corvin stared at her for a half-second, his brain struggling to process the command from this impossible source. But then he saw the look in her eyes, the life-or-death urgency, and his training took over. He spun on his heel and disappeared down the corridor, his heavy boots pounding on the stone. Marian knelt beside Roderick again, clutching the heavy sword. She brushed the sweat-damp hair from his forehead. His skin was cold, clammy. His breathing was a faint, shallow whisper. "Stay with me, Roderick," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, the storm within them reduced to a faint, cloudy gray. He tried to speak, but only a bloody froth appeared on his lips. His gaze was fixed on her, a silent, desperate plea. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every rasping breath he took felt like it could be his last. Finally, she heard the sound of shouting and struggling in the corridor. Corvin reappeared, dragging a terrified, still-bound Lord Elian behind him. "Here," she commanded, pointing with the sword to the floor beside the king. "Put him on the floor," Corvin shoved Elian down. The traitorous lord landed in a heap, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the king's condition. A flicker of triumphant satisfaction crossed his face before being replaced by fear as he saw the sword in Marian's hand. "What are you doing, witch?" he spat. Marian ignored him. She looked at Roderick, then at Elian. She could feel it now, the foul invisible cord that connected them, pulsing with dark energy, siphoning life from one and pouring it into the other. Sever it, not shatter it. She took a deep breath, her knuckles white on the hilt of the sword. She was not a warrior. She had never held a weapon in her life. But this was not about skill or strength. This was about will. This was about magic. She poured her own energy, her own life force, into the blade. She let the humming power in her veins flow down her arms and into the steel, feeding the sword's latent power, awakening it. The ancient runes etched into the blade began to glow with a soft white light. She rose to her feet, standing over the two men. She lifted the heavy sword with both hands, the point aimed at the space between them. The white light from the blade intensified, casting stark shadows on the walls. She could see the tether now, a shimmering, ugly cord of violet-black energy, pulsing like a diseased artery. "What you have bound in malice," she intoned, the words coming from a place deep within her, a place of ancient power she had never known she possessed. "I will now sever injustice." She brought the glowing sword down in a swift, clean arc. The blade did not touch either man. It sliced through the air, through the space where the invisible tether connected them. There was no sound. There was only a flash of blinding white light and a wave of pure, silent force that threw her backwards. She landed hard, the sword skittering from her grasp. The room plunged back into semi-darkness, the only light coming from the torches in the hall. For a moment, everything was still. Then Elian screamed. A terrible, soul-tearing shriek of agony. He writhed on the floor, his body convulsing. The curse, severed from its victim, had recoiled back upon its caster. The dark magic, with nowhere else to go, was now consuming its own source. Dark mottled patches bloomed across his skin, his veins turning black beneath the surface. His screams faded into a gurgling death rattle. And then he was still. Marian ignored him. Her eyes were fixed on Roderick. He was no longer bleeding. The dark stain on his tunic was not spreading. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Then another. The color was already beginning to return to his face. The poison, its source cut off, was receding, burned away by the potent fire of his alpha blood. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his chest heaving. His stormy eyes, clear and sharp once more, found hers across the room. He looked from her to the now dead Elian, to his own sword lying on the floor, its runes no longer glowing. He looked back at her, and the expression on his face was one of profound, earth-shattering awe. She had not just saved him, she had wielded his own power, channeled it through his ancestral blade, and passed judgment on his enemies. She had done the impossible. Slowly, painfully, he got to his feet. He swayed for a moment, and Corvin rushed to steady him, but the king waved him off. He walked on unsteady legs across the room until he stood before her. She was still on the floor, shaken and exhausted, the adrenaline fading, leaving a deep, bone-weary ache in its wake. He knelt before her, just as he had before. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. There was no passion in the gesture now, no desperation, only a deep, soul-shaking reverence. The seeress of the Vain Kings was said to be wolfless, he whispered, his voice hoarse, reciting a line from a legend she had never heard. Her blood was not of the wolf, but of the deep earth. Her sight was truth, and her touch was judgment. He looked into her eyes, and she saw not a king looking at a subject, but a man looking at his destiny. "It was never a curse, Marian," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your silence, your gift. It wasn't a flaw. You were waiting for a wolf strong enough to call it forth. Waiting for me." 6 moons had passed. The snows of winter had melted, and the scent of damp earth and new life rose from the forests surrounding the keep. The great hall, once a place of profound humiliation for Marian, was now a tapestry of celebration. Torches burned brightly, casting a warm, golden glow on the assembled pack. The air was thick with the smells of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the collective, contented musk of wolves at peace. Marian stood on the dais, beside the great stone throne, not behind it or in its shadow, but at its side. She wore a gown the color of a midnight sky, and a simple hammered silver circlet rested on her dark hair. It was not a crown of dominion, but a mark of office. The king's seeress, her office, her truth. She no longer hid the faint stains of pigment on her fingertips. They were a badge of honor now, a testament to the power she no longer concealed. She let her gaze sweep over the hall. She saw the powerful alphas and betas. The same wolves who had once looked at her with contempt, or worse, with pity. Now their heads were bowed in respect. When they met her eyes, they did not see a broken, wolfless thing. They saw the woman who had unmasked a conspiracy that reached from the heart of the court to the rival kingdoms in the south. They saw the healer who had saved their king's life, not with herbs, but with a power they still did not fully understand, but had come to revere. Valerius was gone. His complicity, his silent, opportunistic waiting, had earned him not the swift death of a warrior, but the ultimate shame for a pack wolf, exile. He was stripped of his name and cast out, doomed to wander the wilds as a lone wolf, a fate worse than any blade. His absence was a stark reminder of the new order, of the unyielding justice of the king, and his terrifyingly perceptive seeress. A large, warm hand settled on the small of her back. Marian didn't need to look. She knew his touch, the way a flower knows the sun. She could feel the steady, reassuring strength of him, the low, calm thrum of his power. King Roderick Vane stood beside her, his presence a formidable anchor in the sea of faces. The near-death experience had not diminished him. It had forged him anew. The last vestiges of his youthful arrogance had been burned away, replaced by the quiet, unshakable confidence of a king who had looked into the abyss and had been pulled back by a miracle. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "Are you well? You have been quiet tonight." She turned her head, her lips grazing his scarred cheek. "I was just remembering the last time I stood in this hall," she whispered back. "I was so afraid. I thought your silence was the most dangerous thing in the world." He turned her gently to face him, his stormy eyes soft, all the turbulence stilled. "I was a fool, a king ruling by instinct and suspicion, blind to the truth that stood before me the entire time." He lifted a hand and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers lingering on her skin. "My silence was dangerous, but your silence was just waiting for a voice." He was right. For so long, the hollow space inside her had been a source of shame. She had tried to fill it with the lies she painted, with the quiet rituals of her art. But it had remained an emptiness, an aching void. Now she understood. It was not an absence of a wolf. It was the presence of something else, something that had needed the catalyst of his wolf to awaken. They were two halves of an ancient power, a bond of sky and earth, of fang and root. Later, when the feasting had wound down, and a soft, melodic tune was being played on a lone harp, he led her from the great hall, his hand in hers. They did not go to his chambers, but up, to the highest battlements of the keep. The moon, a perfect silver disk, hung in the vast velvet sky, bathing the world in its ethereal light. The great dark expanse of the forest stretched out below them, a sleeping giant breathing the scent of pine and night-blooming flowers. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, simply breathing the cool night air, their shoulders touching. The bond between them was a tangible thing now, a quiet, humming current that flowed between them, needing no words. "I spent my life painting lies to hide myself," Marian said softly, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "Now I want to paint the truth, our truth." Roderick turned to her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "What truth is that, my lady Cirrus?" She smiled, a real, unfettered smile that reached her eyes. "That a king's greatest strength is not in his crown, but in his scars, and that a healer's greatest power is not in what she mends, but in what she chooses to protect." She reached into a small pouch at her belt and brought out a tiny, shallow clamshell. Inside was a luminescent paste of silver dust, mixed with a single drop of her blood, and a single drop of his, which she had taken from him that morning with a silver pin. It was the color of liquid moonlight, shimmering with their combined magic. She dipped her finger into the paste. "May I?" she asked, her eyes holding his. He gave a solemn nod. He unfastened the top clasps of his tunic and pulled the heavy fabric aside, baring the scarred, powerful expanse of his chest. In the center, just over his heart, was a faint web-like scar, the only remaining physical trace of Elian's curse, a mark that his own potent healing could not entirely erase. Marian leaned forward and gently, reverently began to paint on his skin. Her finger was her brush. She did not paint a sigil of warding or revealing. She painted a new symbol, one of her own creation. A sleeping wolf, curled protectively around a single deeply rooted tree, its branches reaching up to embrace a crescent moon. It was a sigil of union, a mark of balance, of a bond that had saved a kingdom. As she completed the final stroke, the sigil flared with a soft, silvery white light. It was not the sickly violet of the curse, nor the stark white of the sword's judgment. This was a warm, gentle, living light. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat, sinking into his skin, not as a brand, but as a blessing. The light faded, but the image remained, a shimmering, permanent mark upon him, a truth made visible. Roderick looked down at the sigil on his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He reached up, his fingers tracing the glowing lines, a look of profound wonder on his face. "You have marked me," he whispered, "for all the world to see." "I have," she confirmed, her voice soft but firm. He lifted his gaze to hers, and all the love, all the reverence, all the fierce, protective passion he felt for her was laid bare in his eyes. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "My healer," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "My queen, my dawn." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss from the night he had almost died. It was a kiss of deep, abiding love, a promise of 1,000 sunrises to come, of a future forged not in secrets and shadows, but in the brilliant, unwavering light of their shared truth. And as he held her there, under the watchful eye of the moon, with the scent of the forest rising to meet them, Marian Lerwin felt the last echoes of the old aching emptiness inside her finally fade away. The silence was finally, blessedly, filled with a song.